Hi everyone, Dr. McGowan here. Today we're going to learn about running records, and you may be a little intimidated if you know much about them. They can be a little tricky, but once you get the hang of it, they're not too bad. They're actually fairly simple to do. So don't get frustrated. The more you practice, the more proficient you'll become. I'm going to break the video into 3 sections. We're going to do a little short video on what a running record is, kind of what they look like, and then we'll do one on how to actually conduct a running record and give you some opportunities to practice. Then finally, we'll show you how to actually score one. And so those are the 3 segments that we'll do. So give me a second to have a little drink of my hot cocoa so you can see my cute coffee mug. This is actually the better side. Thank you. Okay, I'll get serious now. All right, so I'm going to pause occasionally so that I can transition some materials around, but hopefully it'll run fairly smoothly. So stick with me. Okay, here we are, part 1 of our series on running records. So the first thing we want to do is talk about, if I can get it to transition, just kind of where running records fit in the overall scheme of assessments. You probably know that a running record is an informal assessment, so it's not standardized. It doesn't have quite the rigor that the standardized testing might, but it's a very useful tool for the classroom teacher. And it would be considered an observational type of assessment. It is really great for observing children's behaviors as they read, the skills that they are able to perform already and the ones they're lacking, and just some overall general observations about their reading fluency and all kinds of things like that. So it's kind of where it fits in to the assessment world. So there are several goals of a running record. Off to the left there, you'll see a little picture. That's what an actual running record looks like, although you'll see a lot of different variations of that today. One of the goals is to actually determine our students' instructional reading level. When we conduct a series of running records over different texts, we can actually identify what level of text would be appropriate for use in independent reading, such as if they're reading a library book for their own purposes on their own without support, we want them on independent level text. But if we're working on teaching them reading strategies or doing our guided reading groups, we want things that are on their instructional reading level. And so this helps us to determine what level of materials they could handle. Is a second grader able to read second grade level text at an instructional level? Maybe so, maybe not. Maybe they need something a little lower. Maybe they need something much higher. So a running record can help us determine that. And it can also show us where their frustration levels start so that we don't give them instruction using materials that are way too difficult. Another goal of a running record is to help us analyze the cueing systems that the student uses and the ones that they're not using yet so that we can teach them about them. We're going to talk more about cueing systems in another part, the third part of our video. So rest assured, we'll get to it. And we also, through the running record, can analyze the student's strategic processing of text. How are they able to make attempts on words that they're unsure of, so we can do things like that by observing them through a running record. And we can also, and this is really important, we can use the results from running records to guide our instruction. This is probably one of the biggest differences between the benchmark testing that they do at the schools and a running record, a true running record, is that we can actually use the information to make instructional decisions for the child and differentiate and individualize that instruction. The benchmark will let you know if they're not cutting it in some area, but it really doesn't tell you how or why or what they are doing. It just tells you when they don't score enough. And so a running record is going to give you so much more information as a classroom teacher that it will really benefit you in the long run. So here's some examples of what running records look like. The one on the left is the traditional. This is what the actual scoring should look like. If we look at it, you see page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is probably a very simple leveled reader. And you can tell there's only a couple of sentences on each page, just by the way it's marked here. You don't see the story here. The child is looking at a separate book or text and they're reading, and you're using a blank form. You could actually use a blank sheet of paper, to be honest. You don't have to have this fancy form. That's one of the beauties of a running record, is that you could literally be on a deserted island with nothing but a piece of tree bark and a sharp stick, and you could do a running record. So that's a little silly, but you could theoretically. So it's very flexible. You can do running records on anything, anywhere, anytime. And that's really handy. You don't have to have a certain form with things typed in. This on the right here is what is commonly used in the schools for benchmark testing. They will call it a running record. And truthfully, it's kind of, a lot of times what they're using for benchmark testing is really kind of a combination of a running record and an informal reading inventory, because it usually has a comprehension measure. And a true running record, the way Marie Clay developed it, doesn't even have a comprehension part to it, except for informally if you ask the students some questions or informally ask them to retell. But it's not an actual part. It's not a goal of the running record to analyze comprehension. And so what you see in the schools and they call a running record is similar. One of the big differences is you'll see the actual words here and they're scoring on top of it. And that makes it a little easier, but then that's not exactly the traditional original running record, the way Marie Clay developed it. But you'll see both of these and they're really very similar. For all intents and purposes, they're both running records, just you're going to see different kinds. The things that you'll see that are the same are that there'll be a place here with lots of check marks and other writing. That's how we score it. And then over here, you'll see 4 columns. That's where we count all the errors that they make and then the self-corrections that they make. And then over in these last 2 columns is where we analyze the errors that they made for the queuing systems and analyze the errors, the self-corrections they made for the queuing systems that prompted those self-corrections. So we'll learn more about that when we learn how to score, but that's what all that gibberish means. And so that's just what a scored running record might look like. When you conduct a running record, there's a couple of things you need. One of them is you need leveled readers or some kind of text, but for our purposes, the best place to collect a running record on a student is during guided reading groups. And so during guided reading groups, you're going to be using text that's at their instructional reading level. So it's really easy to identify a leveled reader and use that during guided reading, and then just capture a little running record as they're reading during the session. So this is just a picture of what a leveled reader might look like. And then a blank form. And like I said before, you could use a blank sheet of paper and just draw out the columns and stuff. You don't have to have this fancy form, but it is helpful. And that's the traditional running record form, what it looks like. One thing that I want you to think about is to time your child. If you're doing this for my classroom, I'm going to require you to time the session. It's not that you have to do it out in the real world if someone else is watching this outside of my class, but it will give you so much more information. You can calculate things like the words correct per minute, and that way you can compare that information to what the norms are and find out, how they're stacking up. So it's really a good thing to time your child. And honestly, when you do a running record, you don't have to do it over a huge amount of text. You don't have to do it over the whole book. They might read just 1 or 2 pages of a book if the page has a lot of text on it. Normally, maybe something with 100 to 200 word count, or something that you can read, time them for about 1 minute to 2 minutes is plenty. That's all you really need for your running record. So even if they read a whole book and it takes them 10 minutes, you can just do a little running record on, just a short little snippet of it. So that's good to know, right? Okay, so one of the things that you're going to need to do is learn the markings and what you write down when they're reading. And the thing that's a little trickier about a running record is that every single word they say, you're putting something down on the paper. And so it gets a little tricky. If you're watching this for my class, we have this information in your course packet or your textbook, but I've put it in here so that we can look at it together. The easiest marking is when they're just reading along and they're reading words correctly, every single word, you're going to put a check mark. So that's pretty simple. Then the next thing you're going to do is if they leave out a word, the general rule is whatever the child says goes on the top of the above this line, and whatever they should have said or what the text says goes on the bottom. So if they omit a word or leave one out, you'll draw a line here to show that the child didn't say the word when they should have said this word. So what the child said goes on top, what they should have said goes on bottom. So that would look like, that's how you would score an omission. If they insert an extra word, which kids do sometimes, they'll add an extra word in there when they're not supposed to. Maybe they get excited. Maybe they're just, it makes sense for them to have the word in there. There's a lot of reasons why they might do that. It's kind of the opposite of the omission. This time we're going to put the word on top to show the child said a word when they should have said nothing. We'll put the dash on the bottom. So that's when they add in an extra word. We call it an insertion. And all of those three things there, well, not correct reading, but these two things are both what we call scorable errors. You'll also have them substitute words sometime, and you're again just going to write whatever they said on top and what they should have said on bottom. So if they say the wrong word, that's called a substitution, and that's the way you would write that. So if they said dog instead of doggy, you'd write dog on top and doggy on bottom. Sometimes they'll repeat, and that's not an error, but it is a behavior we want to make note of. And so we would box around it or draw a line around it and put an R for repeat. If they repeat more than once, we would write a number to show how many times they repeat. Sometimes they'll self-correct. They'll say the wrong thing. Like you'll see here, this is a substitution. They said the word, it should have been this, and then they realize it, and so they self-correct. So they said want instead of went, and then they realized it, and then they said went. So you can write want and then went, like they did, or you can write want and then a check mark to show that they fixed it, or you can say want and then put SC for self-correct. Any of those three ways is appropriate. Sometimes a child will ask for help. We call that an appeal. And when they ask for help, that basically is an omission because they don't say the word, but we also want to recognize the behavior that they're asking for help. So we write it like an omission. We put the blank line above the word, and then we also put an A out here to show that they appeal to us for help. You could write out what's that word, if that's what they said, or what's that, whatever they say, you could put that out under in quotes, or you could just draw the line and put the A for appeal above the word hurricane. Either one is appropriate. And then sometimes the teacher will just say, hey, give it a try or whatever, but sometimes they'll actually tell them the word. Maybe if they've had a really long pause and not making any attempt, and you can tell they're just staring and waiting for someone to save them, then you can count that as an omission because they didn't say the word. But you also want to put a T, or I usually put 2 T's to show that the teacher told. So what that would, you could write that there's a long pause there, or you could just put a dash above the word to show they omitted it and then put teacher told. And I think the implication is, obviously, if the teacher tells them the word, it's because they didn't say it and they didn't ask for help. So we would have put the appeal there. So those are the markings. And sometimes a student will accidentally get off track and they'll skip a whole line of text. And that is really bad on a running record, because every single word on the line they skipped gets counted as an omission. That's a lot of errors, and it's not probably going to be reflective of their true reading ability. And so if that happens, you can stop and say, let's try that again, and go back to the line, like to the beginning of the sentence before they got off track, and let them start over at that point. And if they read it fine, then you just count off 1 point for them getting a do-over, if you will. But otherwise, when they go back, you just score it like regular, and whatever they miss, you just mark it just like you normally would. So we don't want to count that against them if they get off track. You know, kids do that sometimes, and skip a whole line. We want to give them an opportunity to go back and read the text. Okay, so that's what the markings look like. I know it's a lot to absorb, but as you're doing your first few tries, you can use the markings in your course packet or your textbook to follow along and help you. It'll get easier the more you try. One thing I want to encourage you to also do is to have some kind of a progress monitoring form. And this is so that you can keep track of how the child is progressing when they're reading more difficult text. And the way this one is set up, let me see if I can zoom in to show you a little better. So yeah, let's do this. Yeah, you can see that each date that they did a running record on the child is written down here. And this says weekly observations. So apparently they're doing that, yeah, 17th, 24th, 31st. So they're doing weekly observations and they're marking those here. And what they're doing is over here on this side, it's showing the gradient of text difficulty. This is like the leveling system, leveled readers. So if I'm doing the lowest level of text, it would be like a level 0. They started them on level 1. Okay, so whatever leveling system you're using, it might be A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, or whatever. So you put that on the side here. And then if they score at least 90 or above, you're going to draw a circle. That's good, right? If they score below 90% on accuracy, we're going to put a black dot. And that means we're not going to go on yet, because anything below a 90% accuracy is going to be considered too difficult for the child. So we want them to be able to at least read it with 90% accuracy to be at their instructional reading level. Usually 90 to 94% is considered instructional. 95 and above is considered independent. So if they're not scoring at least 90, we know it's basically in their frustration level. So that's how we set this up. And then each time I measure the child, they read a level 1 book and they made at least a 90%. So guess what? The next time I measure them the next week, we're going up just slightly to the next level of difficulty or complexity of book, a level 2. Oh, they scored below 90. So we're going to stay on level 2 for a while, read either that same story a few more times over weeks, but probably different stories at that same reading level. And after they scored a couple more at 90% or above, then they bumped them up to level 3. And when they were consistently several weeks in a row reading different stories with 90% or above, bumped up to level 4. And you can see, and it's possible that maybe the first one they scored right at a 90 or a 91, and maybe by here they were scoring like 98 or something, so they're ready to move on. So that teacher can make that decision. But this is a really great tool for your kids. It allows them to have a real visual of their own progress, which is a motivator to kids. And it's also great to show at a parent-teacher conference, because you can really show how the child is progressing. And so those kinds of things are really very valuable. And so make sure that you've set up a weekly progress report of the running records that you're taking. And it wouldn't be a bad idea also to make note. You could do that out to the side here, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. It's good to measure them on both the informational text and in fiction text so that you can see, do they score consistently? You might even want to do two different spreadsheets, one for narrative text and one for informational text, to see if there's a big difference in their ability to do that, because they have really different skills necessary for them. So anyway, that's a little bit about progress monitoring. You should set these up. If you'll put them in a 3-ring binder with your kids' names and all, you can set them up by your guided reading groups and have them all kind of nice there together. And anytime your guided reading group is meeting, you can just whip that out and do a little quick running record and mark the progress right there. And it's very handy. So that's basically everything about what is a running record. In our next video, we will be going back to talk about how to actually score them and do some practice. So I hope you'll join us for the running record part 2.